Order, order. And welcome to the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, where we are going to be hearing from witnesses from GB Energy and GB Nuclear. And can I welcome our first two witnesses, Professor Juergen Maier and Emma Floyd. Perhaps, Juergen, you could just briefly introduce yourself, and then Emma, I'll ask you to do the same. So,
yes, certainly. So, Juergen Maier and Chair of Great British Energy, Startup Chair indeed, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about my experience for this role, but predominantly a very long 33-year career with Siemens, the last 6 years of which was as Chief Executive of Siemens in the UK, also responsible for deploying quite a lot of green energy in the UK.
Thank you very much. Emma.
Hello everyone, I'm Emma Floyd. I'm a director in DESNET, responsible for the programme to set up Great British Energy, working closely with Juergen.
Well, thank you both very much indeed for being here, and our first question comes from Josh McAllister. Josh.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the committee. The first question was about an issue that was raised during the bill committee process for the GBE bill, which was related to the operational independence of Great British Energy, and there was a lot of reassurance provided during that process that GBE would be distinct from other initiatives that the UK government had tried before, in that it would be very operationally independent from ministers and from the department. And I wanted to get a sense of where that was up to. You're obviously in the process of establishing, setting up, hiring, and I can imagine there might well be some frustrations with Cabinet Office controls or various other bits of machinery of government. So where is the operational independence as of today? What's your judgment on how operationally independent GBE is in its first few weeks and months?
Thank you very much for the question. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that we aren't formally set up as a strategic independent entity yet. Obviously that can't formally happen until the bill has gone through its full course of Parliament. So at the moment we're in that sort of preparation phase for that happening. But the good news is we're living it how we want it to be. And the way we want it to be is that there is a very clear statement of strategic priorities, and we've been working on honing that and making sure we are comfortable with that, and that ultimately is the agreement that we have with the shareholder being the Secretary of State, and once we are totally clear on that, then we're absolutely clear that we are setting this up as a state-owned single shareholder, but arm's length and independent run body. I'm in the process of bringing together the board. We're hoping that we'll be able to make an announcement on some of the first board appointments quite soon, and that it will be that board with myself as chair, and when we get round to having a chief executive, that ultimately will make the key decisions on how we invest, how we deploy that strategy to obviously meet the strategic priorities of the shareholder.
One very brief follow-up, just for example, on the appointment of the chief executive and the senior leadership team by yourself and the board, are you clear yet on who's making that call and what that says about the operational independence of the company?
Yeah, the process for it is very clear, and that is that at the moment it is sort of only me, so I am leaning on some HR support from the department, but I will soon build some of that internally within Great British Energy. We will run the fully open and transparent processes for these roles, and then ultimately we do make a recommendation, and the way that I would view it is that the shareholder doesn't have a right of choice as such, but does have a right of veto. So there is a right of veto. There might be some political reason that the person we believe is not suitable, but ultimately the decision to find the candidates will be that of myself, the chief executive, and the board, and the nominations committee ultimately.
Thanks very much. Emma, is there anything you want to add to what Juergen's been saying?
So completely agree. That's absolutely the intention. That this, really committed to this being an operationally independent company and setting it up in exactly that way. Juergen completely leading the sort of search for who the CEO is in the way that he's described. And we will obviously be having conversations as well with colleagues at the Treasury about how do we get the right sort of financial framework in place for this company to be able to behave in the way that we want it to. I noted you talked about Cabinet Office controls. Obviously getting the right balance there between empowering the company to deliver and accountability will be important.
Okay. Open to the public. Yes. Holly Billington.
Thank you, Chair. I just note that in the Great British Energy Bill, it grants the Secretary of State powers to give specific or general directions to GBE with which the company is then obliged to comply. Now, if we look at similarly state-owned energy companies that we're sort of comparing GB Energy with, they are very clearly operationally independent. How do you reconcile that instruction in the bill with being operationally independent?
Well, so first of all, the direction for the company, we will absolutely hold on to the statement of strategic priorities. That is ultimately what will drive us. I think the sort of right of the Secretary of State to direct the company, I take as being in emergency type of situations.
Give me an example of what might be.
Yeah, so an example I would give you of that is, we've just entering another energy crisis like we did when the Ukraine war started, and we've suddenly got, a huge hike in energy prices, totally unaffordable bills, and there might be some interventions at that point that a Great British Energy might be able to make in order to help such a situation. It may be a situation that arises around a certain piece of energy critical infrastructure where the private sector is running one of those into liquidation, and you might need to step in as the state to support something like that. Now, it might not be that Great British Energy is the right vehicle to do it. There will be other ways, but I would imagine that in those situations, the Secretary of State having the right to intervene and to discuss with the board, and obviously then it will be a dialogue with the board as to what we do in that situation. But I really do see that as a sort of an emergency brake.
Could I just follow up? It's
yes.
Just in relation to GB Nuclear already exists, and their the Energy Act 2023 gives the Secretary of State has a mechanism by which to direct and guide the strategic direction of GBN owing to its broad and potentially shifting responsibilities over time. So they've been set up sort of slightly differently. How do you understand the what you might learn from the way that GB Nuclear has already been set up, and how you do see the operational structure being different for GB Energy as distinct from GB Nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you'll be talking to the chair of GB Nuclear after me, and Simon Bowen and myself have had already a number of conversations in terms of sharing notes and the learning, which look is fabulous to have people have gone before you to have had a go at doing this, and GB Nuclear wasn't the first. I mean, there has been other institutions like the UK Infrastructure Bank, where I've also had conversations to learn from those. And I think the key thing that we've probably learned is that the more independence you can give, the more likely you are to make the right strategic decisions in order to really do what the purpose and the mission of the company is, which is to deploy more renewable energy at a faster pace and create value for society through that.
Great. And Luke Murphy.
Thanks very much, and welcome to the committee. I guess further to Polly's question, I think you were really clear about the specific examples where you think the Secretary of State might intervene. I wonder is that going to be set out in the framework document? Because I think giving reassurance around that genuine independence, operational independence, obviously that confidence will be given through the operation over the course of time, but actually having those specific scenarios outlined in the framework document will give a lot of confidence. So is that what you would expect?
No, absolutely. I think it's important that you do have all of these things written down very clearly. Now, look, you can't foresee all scenarios, but I think to have had some foresight, of taking some of the experience we've had from organisations like Great British Nuclear that have gone before you on this journey. So we will have a framework agreement. So there'll be two key documents. One will be the strategic priorities and the other will be a framework agreement. And that framework agreement will talk more about, how the governance works, what is expected, and obviously, the governance, the onus of that will be on us as as an executive, as a board, etc. But, what we do in terms of, and obviously it's already laid down very clearly that there will be an annual set of accounts that will be filed by the Secretary of State, and things like that will be clearly laid out in that framework agreement.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Emma. Welcome, Juergen. Ultimately, I think we're asking, who's the boss? Is it the Secretary of State or is it GB Energy? And how comfortable would you be challenging the Secretary of State or the government on an issue you didn't agree on?
Look, I've been used to being the boss, but sometimes not quite being the boss for decades. So I run Siemens in the UK and took all of the operational and strategic decisions. But you sort of understand that there might be some time in which your global board, has some right to intervene in emergency situations, and I think that's how I see it. To answer your specific question, do I and will I stand up to the Secretary of State where I believe that an intervention isn't aligned with the strategic intent of what we're creating? The answer is absolutely yes.
Thank you very much. And I'll move you on now to the purpose and responsibilities of GB Energy. You'll be familiar with something that Dan McGrail has said, and a number of other people have made similar comments. He said it's really vital that Great British Energy doesn't disrupt the billions of pounds of private investment the government will need to deliver their clean power ambitions. So the next steps of its development will have to be formed in close partnership with the sector. How will you ensure GB Energy attracts private investment and de-risks rather than crowding out private investment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've spent the first couple of months, so I really started moving on this role sort of in September, and since September, I mean, I've literally had hundreds of engagements, largely with the private sector investors, developers and energy companies, and in all of those conversations, I think I've managed to reassure the private sector that it isn't our intent to go out and compete with them, certainly not where we have established renewable technologies. What we will do, and look, 8.3 billion actually doesn't go that far in terms of buying renewable energy generation assets. So what we will be doing with that money is buying minority stakes. And we will be buying or taking minority stakes in areas where we can give confidence to the private sector to make their investment. So that is likely to be in the newer technology areas. Those new technology areas are pretty well defined, which are floating offshore wind, which are obviously large-scale storage, which could be batteries or hydrogen, and possibly also tidal arrays and those sorts of technologies. And I think the private sector welcomes our intervention to be able to give them confidence to invest in behind us. So we're very confident that with what we're doing as Great British Energy and what the National Wealth Fund is doing, and I'm sure you'll ask me a few questions on that, that we absolutely will continue to and will create a lot more private sector investment and capacity in the market.
I'm glad you mentioned the National Wealth Fund. You'd already mentioned the UK Infrastructure Bank. How will you make sure that GB Energy works effectively alongside those organisations and clearly defines its own areas of responsibility?
I mean, first of all, the very good news is that we have the UK Investment Bank and the National Wealth Fund, because we all know to set up an institution like that takes some time. So I, as Great British Energy, by the time we've got an investment committee on board, etc., it's going to be well into next year before we can make any investments. And obviously you'll be aware that the initial funding is 125 million, so any early interventions we make will be relatively modest. So therefore, in that first period, we will be working in lockstep and have had very good conversations with the National Wealth Fund that they will be making those strategic early investments on our behalf. So that's where we will start. Now, ultimately, where we will go, we have to work that out, and we absolutely are clear that we're not going to confuse the market. We're going to make sure that the market is clear as to how public money flows most effectively to supporting their market. But if I can just try and give a sort of a relatively simple analogy of the way that I'm thinking at the moment, and that is that with the space we occupy, is we ultimately, in 10 years' time, we want to have created a national champion, an energy company. So any strategic investments we make have to be in line with us wanting to build that company. And the investments also have to be in line with the strategic plan that we're setting out for Clean Power 2030 and beyond. So rather than us being the sort of the large-scale investor, let's say in a more free market type setup, we are somebody who's saying, this is what we want to create. There's going to be some gaps in investment. We need more large-scale storage. We need a little bit more offshore wind here. We need some carbon capture over here. And we are then the people who will say, right, how do we crowd in and create the strategic investments which are going to build the strategic national framework for the energy system that we require?
You've mentioned a lot of things there. You mentioned the 2030 date, which, as NESO said, is ambitious and challenging, and they say it's possible. I know that as well. And you mentioned the £125 million. I think I'm right. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's over the first 2 years. Is that fast enough progress for GB Energy's role in achieving 2030?
Well, given we have the National Wealth Fund sitting alongside us, and we're able to work with them and to deploy some of the strategic investments that we want to make, I'm confident that we can absolutely make that work. And obviously, by the time that we're clearer about some of the larger strategic investments we want to make to build our energy company, we will then obviously be clearer through the multi-year spending review as to what will be available in what timing through the next term of the Parliament. But of course we know the full quantum, which is of course 8.3 billion.
I'm sure the rest of the committee is going to probe some of these points a bit further. Vera's next.
Yes, so the National Wealth Fund, the British Infrastructure Bank, there's also the British Business Bank, so they're all there. And as I understand, and it sounds as if I'm an expert on the banking sector, I'm not, but what I understand about investors is that part of the problem is that there are not the right financial products around that brings private investment in. And I'm wondering, would GB Energy sort of talk to Treasury or have conversations about how to design these financial products that will then be attractive to investors in green new technologies, which are currently not coming forward as quickly as I think they should?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, the UK Investment Bank, now National Wealth Fund, I think has done a good job at creating some of those more innovative products, whether that's through supply chain financing or them taking a little bit more risk on debt finance. So I'm getting feedback from the market that there has been a significant move in the right direction on that. Now, we as Great British Energy, we aren't going to be a sort of a bank with all sorts of interesting and complicated financial lending products. That will continue to be the responsibility of the National Wealth Fund. We're going to be more interested in taking equity stakes in key energy projects going forward. But if I may just say one other thing, and that is that, my observation from having been at the other end of this for many, many years, which is as an investor in the UK, is very often it isn't actually the flow of investment that is the issue. It actually tends to be much more about policy stability. It tends to be about the demand that we're able to create for particular technologies. The reason why we as Siemens crowded in behind the offshore wind revolution is because we created the contracts for difference. As a matter of fact, the contracts for difference when your party was in coalition with the government. So, and I think this is also the beauty of a great British Energy, that we're a national champion. We have some capital to deploy. We also are able to have some influence. We're not the policy makers, but we're also able to have some influence on the policy that will be set, and to help ensure that that policy stays stable so that investors have the confidence to invest in their technologies going forward.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. I was just going to go back slightly to sort of the companies that you sort of envisage that the investment is going to go into, and are you seeing it sort of as it's going to be new companies, existing companies, UK-based, international, and then what are you going to base it on? Is it things like business plans, number of jobs that they're going to be created in the UK, rates of return, sort of the risk level? And I guess all of the above is not necessarily a particularly helpful answer. So sort of in terms of your matrix of how these things are going to be decided, how do you see those things sitting?
All of the above. But to be less flippant than that, we will absolutely, as an investment committee, have very clear investment criteria, which we haven't yet written down. But honestly, I think you've nailed them. It is exactly those. Obviously, we're looking to make a return, and we are setting this up as a commercially savvy, innovative company that will look for its revenue streams. That said, we are going to be, hugely socially responsible in terms of what we do. I think I come with pretty good experience on that, having been lucky to have worked for a company that took both of those things very seriously throughout its history. So therefore, of course, we will also be looking for the amount of jobs and the local value that we're able to create. And we will also have as a criteria being able to take communities with us on this journey, because we know that communities ultimately need to see the benefit, such that they're also going to be supportive of some of the more complex and difficult planning decisions that need to be made over creating this new energy system.
Thanks very much. I'll move on to Polly Billington, who's going to ask you about cost of investments.
Well, it was.
You're on to the next. Yeah.
Yes, because that's right. Okay, sorry.
Right. If you want to follow
I was
up
being
this
distracted.
first,
No, I actually wanted to do
you have the
a
opportunity.
follow-up question to
you have the opportunity to do both. So
well, I can indeed. What's interesting is we've looked at this in comparison to other energy, other state-owned energy companies in Europe, and a lot of them have been making a loss. So it will be interesting to understand what you think will be different about GB Energy. And particularly how you identify what the risks there might be around the way that you're going to establish the portfolio.
Yeah, so look, we do need to do a little bit more work on this, but Emma's team kindly, has done a little bit of a study for me on, what some of these other companies, the Vattenfalls and Ørsteds, and I think those are particularly the models we're interested in. I think, an EDF model is probably less the model we're looking for here in the United Kingdom. It's more of the sort of the Ørsted, Vattenfall. It's the national champion, of the new technology areas. And by the way, it's not going to be an Ørsted because Ørsted's assets are largely in fixed offshore wind technology, and why would we want to move into that sector when it's already pretty well occupied? So we are more likely to occupy a space in some of the newer technologies like floating offshore wind. I've already mentioned tidal, large scale storage, etc. But it's that sort of a model that we will approach. Now look, we're going to be unapologetically long term in how we set this up, understanding that some of these technologies are still needing a little bit of prime pumping, but confident that we can take the technologies to scale and that we can make a commercial return. And again, look, I have been here once before, and I was there right at the beginning of the offshore wind revolution, when everybody was telling us that you will never get offshore wind to the sorts of cost levels that we need, and I sat in front of many people like you having these discussions, and look, we even surprised ourselves at the speed we were able to do it at, and then the cost we got there. There was then a little wobble in terms of supply chain costs rising again. But if you look at it overall, what has been achieved has been actually really quite tremendous. And I think a lot of these technologies that we're looking forward to now, none of these are untested technologies. A lot of people are saying, these are still very early stage. Well, look, carbon capture, hydrogen, it's been around actually for a very, very long time. It's just it hasn't been scaled to the level that we now need to scale it, and we haven't managed to yet find exactly the price points at which we can make a proper return on this. But like we did in offshore wind, I'm pretty confident we're going to be able to do it in some of these new technology areas.
Sorry, Polly, so you're confident that a range of these technologies really are capable of delivering the same kind of economies of scale that we now have?
Absolutely.
With wind?
Well, I was just going to follow up, do you have a timeline for when GB Energy might be profitable, bearing in mind?
Well, I've been set a target.
Okay, well, that's the start.
Which is within this parliamentary term. And look, we're going to have to be innovative on this, because it's not just going to be a return from those investments. There are going to be other support lines that we will develop within Great British Energy. One of the areas that we're very keen to work hard on is how can we help accelerate the development through particularly the planning and the consenting scheme, especially where offshore wind farms come onshore, where you need the onshore facilities in order to do all of your staging and your site access work, and obviously all the environmental consenting, etc., etc. And we're thinking, what can we do in this space to help developers get ahead of the game and provide a service in that space. And for that service, you can either charge a fee, or for that service, you could actually take an equity space. So, look, I'm not suggesting that I've yet decided that is definitely going to be one part of the business case, but I'm just sort of giving you an idea of the fact that there are some things we can do that is going to help us generate revenue streams to achieve that objective of being profitable within the first 5 years.
I was going to say, for a layperson, the two objectives that the government's got for GB Energy, which is investing to see a return for taxpayers, but also to invest in projects which are deemed too risky for the private sector, feel a little bit contradictory. How are you going to resolve those?
Well, look, it's like any business decision, and I guess that that's maybe one of the reasons why Emma and the Secretary of State have asked me to do this role, because I have come from a background of taking pretty risky technologies to market with very deep pockets and ultimately needing to make a return. By the way, I want to reassure you that I've also been involved in bringing technology to market that has failed, and I know that the right answer at that point is to fail fast. Now, I genuinely don't believe that the technologies that we're currently talking about are going to fail. I think there's enough engineering prowess. I think there's enough private investors already crowding into these spaces to know that these are going to scale and make workable. But there will be some completely new technologies that will emerge over time, and I think in those, Great British Energy will have a role to be there from the beginning, help pump prime, and then to help define and say, well, look, we might fail fast on one or two of those, and so we will have that proper entrepreneurial mindset to try new and accept that we won't always succeed.
Yeah.
If I might add, it's about the portfolio of range of things that Great Britain Energy will need to think about what it has in order to meet those two objectives.
Sounds like a private equity type arrangement. Is that
no, I wouldn't. I really wouldn't put it in a private equity category. I think it's with deep expertise of understanding the energy market, the energy systems, and the energy technologies. Look, now I'm not pretending and sitting here that I will understand all of these technologies, to the nth degrees. I am an engineer. I have led an engineering company, but my role is to build an organisation that has that expertise and that capability to make these right commercial and technically led calls.
Can I have just one follow-up question, because it sort of goes on to my earlier one about you mentioned influencing policy. Before I came to this place, I've been working on this for quite a long time and found Whitehall quite resistant to hearing the advice from the private sector on people who did know about the fact that regulatory barriers were some of the biggest ones to ensuring capital flows into clean energy. How do you see that mechanism working between yourselves as GB Energy and, dare I say it, Emma sitting with both hats on, both inside the department and also the Director of GB Energy, to make sure that that information flow goes so that actually we might see policy change as an outcome of the experience of GB Energy in investment?
Yeah, well, I'll definitely let Emma comment on this one, because you are right. It's actually, the sort of, the partnership that we're forming. But I think you've actually described one of the key advantages that a state-owned but independently run operation can bring. And I actually think, one of the reasons why other countries have created their Vattenfalls or their Ørsteds, or it might be an EDF as well, is, without some of that sort of insider knowledge, it's actually quite hard to make some of the right policy calls. So I think, we are going to be arm's length, but I think we are also going to be a very trusted organisation in terms of being able to give market and policy advice in terms of what is required for, both for us to do our job, but also for the private market and the investors to do our job. So I do think we occupy quite a unique space in terms of, with our experience, being that sort of trusted advisor. And the second thing I would say is, it's a space that I have occupied also in my private sector role for quite some time, which is how do you, from the true private sector, given we are state-owned and that is slightly different, how do you work to influence policy, ultimately, not for your company's good, but for the market and for the greater good. And so, I do think that's the other thing that probably is why Emma was quite keen that I come on board and help set this up, and there has been, some of you might be aware, for example, of the Made Smarter review that I read and that I led, and the Made Smarter review having become, quite an embedded piece of policy now, which was started in the last government, has now been adopted by this government. So that in itself is quite good, and indeed is genuinely a piece of policy which is all about helping the adoption of digital technologies, which by the way applies to the green economy also. But genuinely having done that, for the whole of the UK's manufacturing industry. So what I'm trying to say is I hope I bring a little bit of credibility in terms of doing that. Now, I'm not sure what Emma thinks about this.
Emma will be the one who'll be sitting in the department.
Absolutely.
And that's from my experience from before coming to this place, is where some of the blockages are.
Yeah, so I think, as Juergen says, I think this is actually a really good opportunity, having a state-owned energy company trying to do this stuff in the same way that elements of the private sector are. So, we have good dialogue with the private sector feeding back, but of course they do have their commercial interests. So a company that is set up to for the sort of public good does have another element of sort of being able to be really sort of clear with us about the experience they're having as a sort of trusted partner, and feeding that back in. Now, it does take time and it can be challenging to kind of change some of those things, but I do think by having Great British Energy being able to put that back in with Chris Stark's mission control, there's a real strong emphasis in the department of we really want to understand what the sort of blockages are and how we can practically address those, and that's part of why the mission control has been created as well. I know Juergen's seen Chris a lot recently as well, so I think there's a really good opportunity for us here with Juergen and Great British Energy Experience coming together with Chris and mission control to really go after some of those blockages that you described.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the next set of questions, but that was very, very helpful. Thank you. And Luke Murphy's going to move on to technology and priorities.
I definitely will do that in 1 second, but it is relevant to the kind of technological question, because I think it's been a theme throughout, but about what the overriding purpose of GB Energy is. So, I mean, in your answer to Harry, you're very clear you want it to be a national champion within about 10 years. And I think in your answer to Harriet, you alluded to some of the key things that are set out in the founding statement. So the desire for it to drive clean energy deployment, boost energy independence, create jobs, and ensure taxpayer, bill payers, and communities reap the benefits. But at different points, those things will come into tension. Now, there are lots of people that have different thoughts about what GB Energy can and should do. Some think mature technology, some think emerging, some think it should be investing in the grid. But one thing I think it absolutely has to do is have a real clarity of purpose. So I guess my question is, what is the overriding purpose that you see for GB Energy? Because some of those things will come into conflict at different points. Do you deliver, if you're making revenue, if you're bringing revenues in and profit, you can either decide to lower bill payers' bills, or you can reinvest it in order to, further advance the journey towards the clean energy target. So when push comes to shove, what do you see as the overriding mission of GB Energy?
Yeah, well, look, I think that's sort of, the skill of a good chief executive working with the board and the team that we assemble to A, make sure that the purpose is crystal clear, and B, to sometimes manage the conflicts that exist to make it fit for all stakeholders. And it's really quite hard for me to prioritise between the purposes you laid out. I mean, I guess the overriding one is that we are accelerating the deployment of clean energy. I think that's the one that sort of, is the headline, and I think the fact that we're going for clean energy 2030, really sort of creates a North Star for that. So I think that's the overriding purpose. But at the same time, if we were to do that and we weren't with that, creating jobs, social value, bringing communities with us, creating lots of opportunities in supply chains, then you would not be fulfilling ultimately the strategic priorities that the company has been set. So, I think that is the overriding one, but we absolutely have to deliver. And that is why we envisage the organisation to be set up with that purpose, but then to be those pillars in the organisation. And those pillars in the organisation will be that sort of investment piece, which I've described in terms of it being a strategic investment piece. The second being the faster deployment and development and accelerating what I talked about in terms of consenting planning. The third area being about local power and community energy, and that being very much about community engagement and benefits. And the fourth area being all about supply chains and the local jobs and the local value that we create in that. And, and I do see that as sort of, there being, executives running each of those pillars in the organisation, and it all has to come together with the chief executive in terms of the overriding purpose.
Thanks. And then I guess moving on to the kind of technological priorities, which I think you've covered a bit, but I guess on timelines, when do you think is reasonable for us to expect the kind of technological priorities and investment pipeline that's going to be adopted by GB Energy to be published, including the statement of kind of strategic priorities by the Secretary of State? What's the timeline for that?
We've said spring next year.
Yeah, so it'll be next year that we'll publish the statement of strategic priorities, and so we're working on it at the moment, doing quite a lot of consultation actually with the sector, lots of conversations with the private sector, community energy groups, etc., to kind of help us really shape that in the most effective way to give that clear steer to the company. So yeah, at some point next year we will be looking to publish that.
Are you expecting a kind of what kind of balance are you expecting between short-term and long-term investments and mature and emerging tech? And you kind of, Emma, you mentioned earlier the kind of the portfolio approach. I think it's been previously alluded that we'd want to see GB Energy making a profit on every investment. Now, Juergen, you, I think rightly, from my perspective anyway, refer to the fact that some investments fail, and I think governments need to be able to, if you're going to prosecute a proper working industrial strategy, you have to be willing to fail as private business does and then move on. So I'm just kind of interested in that's the clear kind of, there's a portfolio approach, and then what's the balance between short and long, mature and emerging?
I'm going to take the portfolio one, and
Yeah.
I'll take the long short term. Then.
So yes, it has to be a portfolio. I completely agree with you that this is not going to be successful if we take the view that nothing could fail, because in this sort of space, some things will, and if it's not, then actually we're not taking enough risk, and we're not being value adding enough. So yes, it's absolutely a portfolio. It is not a case that we're saying every single thing that GBE does has to return. That has to be at the portfolio level. That's absolutely the case.
Yeah, and in terms of the long and short term, I've sort of said, look, we're unapologetically long term, and I like that term because, you know, I believe in long termism. I believe in policy stability. In the end, I think that is also what helps crowd the private sector funding in. But I'm also realistic that we're going to have to score up a few quick wins, and those quick wins are therefore more likely to be in the mature technologies, and that will likely be in the community energy space. I think in terms of sort of community energy, I do think, you know, some of the sort of maybe solar on public sector buildings, public sector land, I think seems to be a bit of low-hanging fruit in terms of some earlier wins in terms of getting a few megawatts, maybe even gigawatts on the grid, but also helping to see a community benefit through those.
Very quickly, is there a tension between investing in mature tech in order to get, which some have suggested GB Energy might want to do, in order to build a revenue base to then invest more in emerging, and wanting to only play a role that's supportive of the private sector and crowding in private investment? Will you ever make investments solely to make a profit to generate revenue to invest elsewhere, or is that you don't see that as the role of GB Energy?
Well, I think this will be, it comes back to your question, Harriet, earlier. I think this will be one of the criteria of the investment committee, actually, which is very important, and I do think we will be very cautious in terms of taking investment decisions, you know, purely for short-term commercial gain that ultimately crowds out private sector investment. You know, I think that would be a wrong decision, whilst the temptation might be there. So I think the more likely lever for us to make those sorts of investment is because we believe, because we're a state-owned independent entity, that, you know, we can help create some community benefit from doing these sorts of schemes, which again, you know, I think a state-owned entity is more likely to stand behind.
Thanks for clarifying that point. That's very helpful. Julie Minns.
Thanks very much, Chair. It's just building on Luke's point here about your role in encouraging the nascent technologies, and I'm thinking about maybe CHPs. You've mentioned solar. I would say that arguably is a technology that's already mature in the market. But CHPs, community energy, hydro projects. Do you see a role for GB Energy there in actually picking up those technologies that haven't yet got to market scale? And if so, how are you going to go about doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, we would like in the community energy space to take, you know, any scheme where, you know, it's already pretty mature and we can add a service that accelerates and replicates faster. The thing in my mind is almost having a sort of a community energy in a box approach. Now, look, there are many community energy schemes already out there, some delivered very well, but what we don't seem to have is the memory in terms of how do we now take the lessons from that and how do we put it in a box and how do they roll that out 10 times in different places. In other words, you know, here is the handbook of how you acquire the land, of how you get the planning, how you do the consent, how you do the engineering, how you do the health and safety, and all of these things. And I'm sort of envisaging that Great British Energy could offer a service in that space that will help scale the project. So it's less about the actual technologies, it's more about the the methodology and the project management to be able to scale those across the country. And certainly solar, and I do think the sort of the local hydro schemes, there are a few of those around the country that have been quite successful. CHPs is a bit of, we're not quite sure yet, because does that sort of fit within community energy, or does that fit sort of more into an area of heat networks, which is currently sat somewhere in Desnes? That's a discussion we still need to iron out.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We're going to move on to Bradley Thomas now on skills and jobs.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Chair. So, just splitting the skills and jobs piece into two sections. Clearly for GB Energy, as a company, you're going to need to acquire new talent to support the objectives of the company and develop that talent in-house. So how are you going to do that? Sort of what's the plan that sits behind that? And then the second part of it more broadly, thinking about benefits to the wider economy, how is GB Energy going to ensure that it supports job creation in all of the regions, and particularly net job creation in regions that are transitioning away from fossil fuels, particularly Scotland, thinking about North Sea oil as a particular example?
Yeah, two great questions. Look, and on the first, all I can say is that the encouragement and support that we're getting from the private sector towards setting this up is absolutely huge. So I've got private sector companies coming to me and saying, when you've identified your workforce plan, if you need people, for us to certainly help get you going, to second people in and to help you, then we will help you do that. Now, we're obviously not going to staff everything with secondments, and well, we will do some of that and some of it in partnership. But that also gives me confidence that we are also going to be able to attract the right skills into the company. Now, look, we're obviously going to take a lot of those skills from the private sector, but I think the sort of the quid pro quo here is that we're also going to throw a lot of value back into the private sector. And just on your first question, we're going to be HQ'd in Aberdeen. I do think there is a big opportunity to take a lot of people from the oil and gas sector. As a matter of fact, that is already the trend. When I was up in Aberdeen a few weeks ago, I was walking around some of the renewable energy technology centres. I asked 10 people, what did you do before you worked here? Oh, I worked in oil and gas. So, it's not like we're just, we're beginning this. This is happening. It's real, and I think we just want to accelerate and do more of that. So I think that will be where a lot of the workforce will come from in Aberdeen. But you are also right with your second question. Is that the real prize here is in the supply chain, right? And actually, in the broader energy companies that you're helping accelerate their technologies, and this is actually what is just hugely exciting for me. We have about 200,000 people in the oil and gas sector across the country, and we already today have around 600,000 jobs in the broad clean energy sector. I know that's not all energy generation, but 30,000 people are in the offshore wind sector, and we're pretty sure we can get that to 100,000 within the next 5 to 10 years. So, the numbers more than marry up. So it's now a question of, do you get the timing right? And do you get the right skills in the right places? And exactly what sort of skills is required. But one of the things we've been lacking as a nation is we have been lacking this overall strategic plan, which we're now going to get, that ultimately drives which technology areas in where, in which clusters. And now you're giving much more of a clue also to your local authorities and to your local colleges, in terms of what they need to do to actually strategically deliver the right skills that you need. And look, and I'll just give you another anecdote. When we as Siemens built our offshore blade factory in Hull, I mean, it was 10 years ahead of the game we were doing that. that. But guess what? The day the factory opened, there was no colleges that were readily providing us the skills that were needed in the SEMA sector. We were having to set up the training facilities to do it. We were flying people to Denmark to be trained because it wasn't there. And that's what we've got to change, to say, look, we've got a strategy here, we know what we're going to create, and therefore it's now blindingly obvious in terms of the skills system we're going to create. Now, Great British Energy isn't going to be doing that, but we can be part of creating the master plan.
Okay, thanks. 2 follow-ups, if I may. Do you have a figure on how many jobs you expect to be created and hosted at the Aberdeen HQ? And then secondly, on the point about the regional job creation, the regional growth, you've touched upon local authorities engaging with devolved administrations, probably include LEPs in there as well. To what extent do you see GB Energy sort of actively pursuing that as sort of, an engagement department with the regions? How do you see it being structured? And, that alignment with the overall industrial strategy that the government is coming up with, to cover the whole of the UK?
Gosh, you've asked about 5 questions in that one, actually, but they're all great questions. I mean, the first answer in terms of how many jobs in Aberdeen, because we need to start with the strategy, which we haven't got. We haven't yet completed what we sort of think the workforce plan is going to be. We know what the titles are going to be and what the headings, and indeed we're starting to recruit into some of those, but we haven't got the full workforce plan. If you want me to put an estimate on it, I think, within this first term, which we're calling this first 5 years, I think it'll be 200 to 300 jobs that we will have in Aberdeen in the office. Now, look, what happens beyond that, let's see, but that's where we're currently at. In terms of the engagement with industrial strategy, there's lots of conversations going on there with Minister Sarah Jones, with industrial strategy, and I'm certainly committed to making sure that we line up the whole supply chain piece. Actually, not, it's DESNES, Great British Energy Department for Business and Trade, it's also DCIT. So, we're going to create quite a lot of coordination to make sure that all of that does work together. And your final question about local authorities and engaging, one of the roles we have already created is a sort of a head of business development and partnerships, and under that we do expect to have a sort of a engagement with local authorities, and that could be around the skills piece. Is also very, very, very much in the forefront will be the local energy and working with local authorities on that local energy space.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. So, just following up on that last point around the engagement, you talked about engagement with local authorities. There are pan-regional partnerships that have been doing work in this space on skills. So, do you see a role for partnerships like the Western Gateway and the Northern Powerhouse? And if so, how do you plan to engage with them?
Well, look, we are not going to be the engine that's going to resolve the skills challenge. We are going to be, an energy company that is in that strategic space I've designed. Having said that, we have a responsibility, and we need to make sure that we're getting the right skills for our company, and we need to help make sure that other companies get access to their skills. So we will play with all of the actors in that space. Now, as previous vice chair of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and the chair of the Western Gateway, being a very good friend of mine, I think it will be exactly those sorts of bodies that we engage with to help come up with some of these strategies. And I do see a role for Great British Energy to also coalesce some of the private sector into this space. And indeed, there's already been private sector companies that have come to me, they say, when we're clearer on the plan of where we're, for example, going to create the carbon capture clusters or hydrogen clusters, which of course are already pretty clear where they're going to be. Can a few of us get together and can we sponsor, local colleges in order to support them at creating the right sort of skills and training. So I think we can be a bit of a convener and bringing people together, but we can't answer the entire skills problem.
Just come very quickly back, not just about skills, it's also about these bodies have also been doing work on the issues of technologies, and you talk about technology clusters, and some of that work
has involved those partnerships. So it's just trying to understand how you relate to them, if at all.
Well, look, I'm glad you've said that, because we often do get a bit sort of focused on what some of the what we see as the sort of the core skills in terms of the actual renewable energy technology. I do see a massive opportunity, particularly in terms of supply chain for the UK, to jump into some of those more innovative spaces, whether that's digital, drone technology, robotics, and all sorts of areas which, of course, are serving this market. Quite how we bring all of that together and what the strategy is, I'll be honest with you, I haven't quite got my head around. It's a great question, but we will certainly be giving some more thought to.
Thank you very much. We will move on to our final section of questioning, community benefits and energy bills, and I'll ask Torkel Crichton to start, please.
Thank you, Chair. Juergen, very excited to hear you talk about community energy in a box, and the fact that community energy will be one of the 4 pillars of GB Energy. I'd like to ask, what kind of level of investment and return you'd see in that, because my reading of it is that GB Energy doesn't quite realise the ambition that some communities have. For example, in my constituency, there's something like 23 megawatts produced by community power companies, £2.5 million a year to these communities. If you do the maths, that would be billions, 1.6 billion across the whole UK. And you talked about taking the expertise from industry, but I believe that in terms of community energy, you might as well take the expertise whether it exists in communities by setting up a community energy unit. That's what I think you should do, but by talking about community energy in a box, I think that's what you're thinking too.
Yeah, no, I mean, you make a very good point. I mean, when I was talking about taking skills from the private sector, I was, obviously a little bit more in my sort of investment and development box. I think on the community box, I think you're right. The skill set, a lot of it is probably out there in the community, and I've visited a number of community energy schemes, and it's I'm quite in awe of when you see what some of the communities have achieved in terms of creating those local schemes, with all the barriers that exist around that. And I guess that's what excites me, which is to say, if a community can do that and get through, let's be clear, there's a lot of hurdles in terms of particularly the planning, in terms of getting the grid connection, all the things that we know are issues. And, and if we can just sort of bottle some of that knowledge and maybe recruit some of that knowledge, as you say, and then we can, put the knowledge in a box and scale it. I think that would be very exciting.
That's very reassuring to hear. So now, the same way as the private sector is queuing up to speak to you and see you and lend you their expertise, community energy companies are there ready to go, but don't have the finance, the pump priming finance. Do you see a role for GB Energy in doing that?
Yes.
You do indeed.
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. Now again, look, we'll be partnering, right? I mean, but I think we will probably be able to be a seed funder in terms of getting some of that up and running. We would hope that local authorities might take a stake, and then obviously one of the services we'll have out of the box, which has already been developed by many communities that we will just learn from and pinch and to scale, is to obviously allow the community to invest and ultimately benefit from some of those as well.
Okay. So you, as you said earlier, you see a return within a parliamentary term for the government in this investment.
Yeah, well, look, again, I think we're going to have to look very innovatively as to how we can do that. I mean, putting our stake into a community energy scheme and looking to make a massive return out of that, I think is going to be unlikely. As a matter of fact, would probably be irresponsible, because you don't want to make a greater return than anybody in the community is, right? You're all going to make the same return on that particular proposition. However, there might be other things you can do. We've got to get that energy to the consumer, and now we could potentially work with an energy retail company and see, what sort of models can we work with you, particularly on flexible energy, to get to your consumers. We're now helping deliver some benefit to the community, but maybe as being part of that and having helped design that, maybe there is a small stake that we can have in return in that for Great British Energy. Again, I'm not suggesting we've fully mapped out the business case for that, but I'm just giving an indication that there are business models you can create that allow you to make some return even out of something like community energy.
You're anticipating my final question, which is, yes, return corporately, yes, a return for communities. What about a return for consumers? How soon can consumers expect to see a benefit from having a state-owned energy company?
Well, actually, I mean...
in terms of their bills coming down.
Yeah, so, so let's just quickly stick to community energy. So in community energy, I think I've already explained where that is. And genuinely, I'm totally excited about the sort of this, flexible energy offering, which some energy retail companies are already actively trialling out there. I've got an energy provider. I have an app, and I'm one of the avid daily users of saying, oh, look, I can get some free energy at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And look, I know that there's a relatively small amount of consumers playing in this market, but the more we make that available, I think there's going to be, there's almost going to be a bit of fun in engaging with this. It's almost like going into a retail store and looking for your bargains, but you're shopping in that way for your energy. And I think our local community schemes could help create that. Which the broader, the bigger question I think that you are asking is, how do we pass the benefits of this great renewable energy onto the consumer? Well, look, the answer is what is driving the cost up of energy right now? It's gas. It's not renewable energy which is driving the cost up. What drove the cost up when we had the energy crisis? It was gas that was driving it up. So we all intuitively know that the more renewable energy you put onto the grid, the more you're going to create the opportunity to lower your prices. Now, how you lower the prices ultimately is a role for more than just Great British Energy. We are part of that, but this is now a whole complex of the regulator. It's a whole complexity of the energy retailer. And I'm sure, as you're aware, there is a market reform project going on that, where we've got to try and find a way of, through new market reform mechanisms, to be able to pass more of that lower cost renewable energy through to the consumer, rather than basing it all on the last price in the grid, which is generally gas. What I'm really saying to you is, we're the enabler of being able to do it. How you do it, I think, becomes a matter for broader and more complex policy.
I think we can all sense your enthusiasm for community energy projects. How much of our generation capacity do you think community energy projects could potentially deliver?
Community energy. Well, the NESO report, which has just been launched a couple of weeks ago, states, and I think it matches actually what we had said in our originally priority statements, is that up to 8 gigawatts, which is pretty huge actually. And hence my excitement. Now, of course, that includes, some larger solar deployment, and includes onshore wind, etc. But that's the target that is laid out at the moment.
I suppose is, how do you define community energy projects? But we won't.
I think we're calling. I think the 8 gigawatts is sort of community energy stroke local power. It's slightly broader.
Right.
Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes. Well, that sort of follows on to my question really about the local power plan, because if the local power plan is sort of almost half the capital of GB Energy, which is a lot, is the local power plan there to facilitate the creation of that 8 gigawatt of potential energy? Because I noticed you were very enthusiastic about flexibility. We know that local energy is one of the key ways of increasing flexibility and therefore improving the grid resilience, reducing the need for a greater strengthening of the grid. Where and how do you see that local power plan developing in order to be able to meet that potential target of 8 gigawatts?
Yeah, now unlocking all of that lies sort of between NESO, which everybody is familiar with, and Chris Stark's Clean Power 2030 mission. And indeed, Chris Stark, who I just met earlier with today, his role, having had the NESO 2030 power plan, his role now is to create the action plan that responds in terms of how are we going to now make that happen. Because for all of us who read the NESO report, we were very encouraged by the fact that we can make this happen, but by heck, there is an awful lot that we have to do and we have to change, and quite a lot of that is policy change, and quite a bit of that is the area that you're probing, which is about how do you really create these local energy systems, the grid connections, being able to really manage that flex and all the rest of it, and that is the ambitious task of mission control to help create the policies and unlock that for us to be able
to... Just to understand a bit better, as I understood it, the local power plan is part of GB Energy's role,
sure.
and that the amount of money that's been sort of allocated for the local power plan is about half of the capital that's been put aside for GB
Can I just come in on that? Because actually ministers haven't formally taken decisions on how money would be split in that way with Juergen, so I don't think that...
Oh right, okay, sorry, I thought it was about...
There was a number mentioned somewhere, but it's not been formally agreed.
No, so there's still conversation to be had about what the right balance is across the priorities.
How do you imagine spending the money that you will have allocated for the local power plan in order to be able to achieve the 8 gig as GB Energy?
Well, I think it's, I think in terms of, how we do it, it's first of all going out there and leveraging what's already out there, as I think we've already discussed, and then, I've already explained, that our role is to see, how can we multiply, again, the sort of the project in a box type of approach. I think that's how we do it. The reason why I'd moved onto how it all works locally is that the whole thing only works if it fits into the national strategy. There's no point putting a load of local power schemes out if the grid doesn't need the power at that point, or you can't get the grid connection for it at that point, or it makes no sense to have the grid connection because you don't need the flex at that of that particular area. So that's why there is quite a bit of work to do for us to work out exactly where strategically we need these to be, that we help scale this up in the right
You did talk, for example, about quick wins early with solar panel, solar power, in order to be able to generate income. I was just trying to tease out a little bit.
Look, we're going to get Chris Stark's plan by the end of the year. I mean, we're not hanging around.
And we're going to finish with Vera Hobhouse, who's
I'm so sorry
that last couple of questions.
Well, I am very much interested in community energy, but a lot of it is really about regulatory changes. And you have already said previously that actually you are an investment company. You're not going to get involved in all these regulatory changes. So I'm still a little bit unclear at this point where really GB Energy sits in the space of just sort of saying, okay, we are making investments where we think it is important, but we can also have a role influencing at least government policy in making regulatory changes, for example, for community energy, because that's at the very heart of community energy is actually regulatory changes, and then they can invest and have the freedom to have the money to invest in these projects. So can you perhaps just at the end explain a little bit more where actually policy sits as well as just being an investment company?
I mean, policy ultimately sits with the Department of Energy, right?
But where you can influence policy.
And I mean, just a couple of things I'll say at the end on that is first, you say we're an investment company. I would always want to add the word a strategic investment company. That's very important to me because, we will be making the investments where strategically it fits within the overall mission of 2030. So we will always be going back to the overall strategy and does this work. Now, in terms of unlocking all of that where we need changes, I'm not sure it's lots of changes in regulation. There is some regulation, but some of it is where you need market reform. And the role for doing that will largely, look, in the end it has to be done by the Department for Energy, so Emma will hopefully add some final words to this, but the driver for that will be mission control. So it will be mission control, Chris Stark's team, that ultimately will be, through the action plan, saying, look, if we're going to make this happen, and we absolutely want to make this happen, these are some of the changes that we need to make in terms of our market reform, our regulation, and we drive them through that way. Now, Chris Stark might use me to say, Juergen, can I just test, is this what you're hearing from the market? Is this your experience in terms of how we need to, so I'm inputting into that, but it is the mission control piece that is ultimately determining that change of policy and unlocking that policy, which we know needs to happen at quite an unusual pace.
If I might just add a couple of points. So I just completely underline Juergen's point, this is an energy company. It's really important we think about it an energy company. Yes, it's going to be doing investment, but it's also going to be developing and over time owning and operating. So it's different from an organisation that's purely about investment. And just on the community energy, one of the things Secretary of State has recently done is actually written to Ofgem asking for some advice around what some of the barriers are to community energy and community benefits type projects. So that will be a really useful piece coming back into the department in the context of taking forward more community energy projects.
Right. Emma, Floyd and Juergen Maier, thank you very much indeed for being our first public witnesses of the new parliamentary session. Order, order. We will suspend the session for a few minutes while we change witnesses. Order, order. And for our second witness session, we welcome Simon Bowen, the Chair of Great British Nuclear. Simon, you're very welcome. Please give a short introduction.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm a nuclear engineer by background, and I retired for a whole 8 weeks before I was asked to come and take a look at what it would take to rebuild the nuclear industry in the UK. What do we need to do to build new nuclear? What's the system required? So a group of us got together, a group of international experts, and over the space of about 100 days pulled together a report which had 25 recommendations, which concluded that, here's the things that you need to do, here's the things that you need to get after, and one of those is the formation of Great British Nuclear, I should say. And Great British Nuclear was formed, and I was asked to be the interim chair. And it is a massive privilege to do that. We've been very busy over the last 18 months. We're now about 140 people. We've acquired 2 sites. We have a multi-billion-pound procurement out in the market with 4 very credible vendors for the SMR selection that we're in the middle of. And what's it in service of? It's in service of energy security and the journey to net zero and baseload power. And we can explore that, I guess, as we go through the afternoon. So the prize is huge for us. It is the regeneration of the nuclear industry. And it's not just about nuclear power, it's all of the benefits that gives in terms of high quality jobs in many areas of that may be struggling in terms of economic development. And also huge export potentials. So this is about not just a energy strategy, it's about an industrialization strategy as well. So as I say, it's a privilege to be leading the organization and to be building on the nuclear program that is started at Hinkley Point. It will hopefully develop into Sizewell, into SMRs, through AMRs to fusion. So very happy to take
Thank you very much. We will explore all of those, I think, I can guarantee. Can you just give us a bit more detail on your setup? You were the announcement of GB Nuclear was 2 years ago. Where are you on a permanent headquarters and on permanent staff? What percentage of your staff are contractual on a permanent basis compared to those who are temporary secondees?
Well, so we're headquartered in Manchester, and
that's permanent.
Yes, that is permanent, and the headcount currently runs at about 140, 30 of which are permanent employees. It took us many months to get a pay agreement through the various government processes, understandably, which really slowed down our recruitment, but we're now starting to accelerate and to bring people in to the organisation. So we have 45% female. We've got a better ethnic mix than we've got across the UK. So we've got a very diverse workforce, which we're proud of, and we are on with recruiting the rest of the staff.
Sure. Now, you mentioned Hinkley to Sizewell. It's an example of where the progress has not exactly been fast. Why is it everything is so slow in nuclear?
Nuclear plants are complex pieces of engineering, and let's not forget that we had 20 years where we did no nuclear developments in the UK at all, and therefore the skills and capabilities diminished to the point where Hinkley have had to rebuild the industry and have done a very good job. And I know Hinkley gets mixed press, but there are some really easy comparators between what everybody says is a fantastic build in Taishan. Hinkley is 2 years behind Taishan, 1 year for COVID and 1 year for engineering changes, and both of those are massive lessons learned. But these are very big, complex programs, big, complex infrastructure programs, and this is a first of a kind. Now, to Sizewell, they will learn an enormous amount from it. Yeah. And there is a lot of data which says that the physical costs of the kit will go down by around about 20%. But then when you look at the burden of administration that we put on the organisations in terms of things like the DCO and the environmental permitting, I mean, the latest data would tell you that the environmental impact assessment alone is 75,000 pages long. Now, that has an enormous burden on the industry, and I can cover that a little bit later on how we handle that. Back to the learnings, though, what can we learn from Sizewell? We learn about replication from Sizewell, and we learn about all of the supply chain development that Hinkley and Sizewell have done, and we can pick that up and we can use it in whatever we build, whether it's another gigawatt reactor, but critically into the SMR space as well. So you have to consider it a program. The final point I'd make is one of the big recommendations that we made, I think the most important recommendation we made in the report was you have to do this as a long-term, multi-year program. I loved what Juergen just said about unapologetically long-term. We have to be. We're a multi-decade program. And until we can give that certainty, it is very difficult for the supply chain and industry to invest. So that long-term commitment to Hinkley, Sizewell, and then fleets of SMRs is the core of what will help us to drive the cost of nuclear down and get it quicker.
Yeah, my question was about, these are very good points. My question was about the speed. You've made the case for the technical complexity and the regulatory framework being part of it. Is that why it takes so long to make decisions?
Decisions in what respect, Chair?
To go ahead. Was it 2007 that Gordon Brown's government approved Hinkley? Construction waited till started 2016. Have I got that right? And we still haven't got a final decision on Sizewell. Are those technical? Is it technical reasons behind that, or what are the reasons?
There is, as you'd expect, there are a multitude of reasons. There are technical issues, of course, getting the design to the stage where you can take it to final investment decision. But there's also all of the work that you've got to do around consenting orders and environmental permitting, and those are all multi-year pieces of work. So the amount of work that's required to be able to get to the point where you can get a permit is significant. We're planning on 6 years at the moment for a consent order, and we think that's really tight. We've got to bring that down considerably. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is these are really risky investments for first of a kind for a scale of plant, a gigawatt scale of plant. And that's why the SMRs are really attractive, because they're a smaller scale, and because their whole premise is that you can build a lot of it off-site and you can build it modular. Then you learn for the first one, but the second, the third, the fourth and the fifth will be much, much quicker. And therefore the learning curve is much quicker, and therefore the delivery is much quicker. So the big advantage of SMRs is you've got much less time between when you start the project and you get them onto the producing electricity, and they'll get faster and faster because you've learned so much.
Yeah, we'll move on to SMRs in more detail very shortly. Just one more question from me. I think I'm right in saying that the new government hasn't set targets for nuclear energy or clarified its ambitions for GB nuclear. What have they said to you about targets, if anything?
So we've had a number of great engagements with Secretary of State and with Lord Hunt, and we've talked about, and the Secretary of State at COP29 talked about how vital nuclear energy was as part of clean energy. All of that is very, very helpful. We have talked to Lord Hunt about what the target is, because the target is really, really important, because it sets down a marker to say that's what we're aiming at, and it is very important. And what he said to us, which we fully understand, is that until we get the multi-year spending settlement, it'll be very difficult to set that target. Now, having said that, what I've suggested, which I think was a valid suggestion, is that as you design the system, as Juergen was talking about, what goes where and when, as you design that system, then out of that should come the nuclear target. And if we're clear that that's exactly what's going to come out of the system work that NESO and GBE are doing, then that'll help settle the industry and give us the clarity that we're looking for. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, yes. Bradley Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and welcome, Simon. You've kind of touched upon this already, but I'll ask this question. The Telegraph has quoted industry sources as saying that GB News is shackled by red tape and a tortuously slow decision-making process. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with it. Does it go as fast as I would ever want it to go fast? No, it doesn't go as fast as I'd want it to. But I fully understand this. What we're talking about is substantial amounts of public money here. and the rigour that you apply to assessing that we are making sure we spend that money sensibly is absolutely a duty for us and a duty for government. So, anything I say about speed has to be caveated by that. And therefore, I fully understand that we have to make sure that the decisions we're making represent good value for money for the taxpayer and give us what we want in terms of energy security and the journey to net zero. I fully understand that. However, I think there are things that we should be looking at, and this is just as appropriate, I think, for GBE and what they need to do, which allows us to move at pace. And I use the analogy to the Olympics. The Olympics was an amazing project, which we delivered on time. We had to deliver on time. But the way it was delivered on time was we had a sort of a forcing function across government, which was absolutely clear on the imperative for energy, for the Olympics, our parallel energy security. And that forcing function can drive parallel decision making within the government departments. And that is, I think, absolutely valid for what we need. If we're serious about delivering to our energy security targets, we absolutely need that. Because if we do decisions in series, we are simply never going to get to the targets that we've set. We've got to find a different way of doing things. And that's not a criticism of any individual or any department. We just need to reinvent the way in which we're doing this if we're serious about delivering energy security. And that forcing function, for me, is absolutely crucial.
Thanks. Move on to SMRs and the selection programme with Josh McAllister.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Simon. And I've got a few questions which I'll try and move through quickly. Just to pick up on a theme that was raised by the two previous questions. Are you permanent yet, or are you still interim?
I'm interim.
Right. And the same with the chief executive?
Correct.
Right. And that's, how long has that been interim now?
Gosh, that's a couple of years.
Okay. Thank you. Spring 2025 is the date that's been shared, and government sometimes refer to only having 2 seasons in a year, spring and autumn. Can you give us any more clarity on when in spring you expect to make an announcement about the next stage of the SMR programme?
No, and the reason, Josh, is that we're into the first stage of negotiations now. So we're into a kind of a discovery phase with our negotiations. I can't go too far because it's obviously commercially sensitive, and we are in an iterative process with the vendors who we've got four great companies, and we're working through what their solutions are, because they are quite different. They're very different companies.
I asked Simon because there's already been a series of delays, and I know these are not entirely within your control, but for the part that GBN does play in them, they want confidence and certainty about a process that keeps moving, and spring is not a confident envelope, right? It's quite a broad one.
So let me answer the question. So we have spent a lot of time talking to the department, and we're more comfortable with the spring date than we have been with the previous dates, because the spring date is something that we have developed with the department.
Spring window.
The spring.
Right. If 24 gigawatt by 2050 were still the goal, would we be on or off track for it at the moment with the delays that we've currently had with the SMR programme?
So are we off track as a result of the SMR programme? No, I don't believe we are. I think we're going to have to be, if we are serious about, if you were serious to take a target of 24, we have to do things differently, and we'd have to look at gigawatt as well as SMRs.
Yeah.
You'd have to do both.
And then can you just briefly talk us through the logic for the SMR competition process itself? Other countries, not for SMRs, but for AMRs, the US federal government has taken a different approach with backing to national champions, you might call them, X-Energy and TerraPower, and has co-invested and made the decision, and they're getting on with construction. We've got potential domestic champion business here in the UK, but we're taking a different approach, which has it will have an implication on the timings of things. Can you just talk us through the competition design itself and where that came from, some of the choices that were involved in it?
Sure. So the decision to run a selection process, a competition, was on legal advice to the department, and you'd have to ask the department exactly what that legal advice was. But it was around subsidy control. That decision was made. They had legal advice, and we were therefore informed that the most appropriate approach to follow was a selection process. Do I support the selection process? Yes, I do, because we, as well as producing energy security and net zero, we've got to be able to demonstrate value for money. And therefore, we've got to be able to do some comparisons to determine what is value for money and what isn't. So I think the selection process is the right way to do this. We've just got to move it as fast as we possibly can so that we don't fall behind countries that have direct awarded.
Yeah, thank you. And then obstacles and challenges for progressing at the next stages. So I'm thinking about things like land, private investment. What are the things that you're most worried about risk-wise for the next stage of the SMR programme?
I think for the next stages, once we've made the decisions, we've then got to ramp up the skills. The skills and capabilities that exist across the UK are very, very similar to the skills and capabilities that sit in infrastructure, and they're almost identical to the skills that we need in defence and the very rapidly increasing defence. So, what keeps me awake at night, that is absolutely one of them, is skills capability and supply chain capability. And we'll only get to really understand that once we get to the next stage of the selection process. I'm not concerned about land, because I think we have, through all of the sites that are in the policy statement, enough sites that we can access and we can successfully develop nuclear. There is a critical decision that government needs to make if you remember, when the previous government were just about to announce the election, the morning before, they said we are going to do gigawatt in Wilver, which came as a surprise to us, I must admit.
I think that's the next question.
Well, fabulous. Let's go covering it.
Final bit from me is just on whether I have a concern that we're being too linear here about SMR, AMR and gigawatt programmes, that we've got GBN mandated with only one task at the moment, which is the SMR competition, and that then needs to fit into a world where we're saying we've got the 2030 clean energy target, and the SMRs won't play a role in that because of the timelines involved, so it'll be beyond that period.
Yes.
which probably be about grid, but then there's a whole series of questions about alternative routes to market for private users of the energy. We don't have policy on that. And then also on AMRs. And my worry is that we're all focused on the SMR competition, but actually we need multiple tracks and to be able to move fleet of foot on this stuff as other countries are. Is that a concern you share as GBN, looking at the policy space?
I think so GBN is set up to deliver the government's new nuclear programme with the first focus on SMRs. Are we spending enough time working with the department on AMRs? We haven't been to date, because we have been focused on getting the SMR selection process up and running, but we are now turning our attention to it. There are some really interesting developments within the AMR space, and I think it is absolutely fertile territory for us to look at and to run parallel tracks. That's number one. The market-led approach, so the likes of community nuclear power, it's really interesting what they're doing. It's different to what GBN's doing because it's off-grid and it's a community-led project, but we would absolutely support that type of market-led approach, because we need all of it. If we're serious about nuclear as baseload power, we need it all.
There isn't currently a process or a facility or function of government that would enable that. Would you accept that? So not just for community power company, but for people that may wish to invest in a data centre and want to locate a small nuclear generator next to it.
I think there's a lot of work to do. Do I think there is a group of us who understand what we need to start looking at? Is there a defined process that you could put something in one end and it comes out the other end? No, there isn't. But there's a lot of work to do on regulation, because the regulating framework has to completely change to make AMRs deliverable in different locations. But there are a group of us that are now starting to turn our attention to it. The alternative routes to market work that the department did last year, or early this year, also contributes to that as an input. But be assured, we are working on this, and because we see AMRs as a critical part of the future energy mix for nuclear. Thank you, George.
Great. Thank you very much. Claire Young is going to ask you about siting and large-scale nuclear. Claire.
Yes, obviously you've purchased the sites at Wilver and Oldbury.
Yeah.
I think you've already touched a little on the question of the steps you're taking to evaluate the potential for further gigawatt scale nuclear power in the UK. But given already Hitachi has abandoned its plans for a new nuclear plant at Wilver, and it's said due to rising costs, what steps are you taking to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself at this site?
So the decision, there is a policy decision required about what you put at Wilver, whether that's gigawatt or whether that's. If I'm not answering your question, please stop me. But I think I know what the question is. Is that if you look at what we need to do at Wilver, as soon as you make a decision, say you make a decision that you want to do gigawatt at Wilver, well, the world has moved on significantly since the Hitachi investment, and it's moved on in a number of ways. Firstly, through the report we did, which was accepted by the department and by the then government, and I believe has been accepted by this government, is government has to invest at the early stages of nuclear programs because the private sector just simply won't take the risk on its own. And that is so obvious across all of these. So, lesson learned number one is whatever we do at Wilver will have to be government backed. Say you do a gigawatt at Wilver, then that's stage one. Stage two, and I've said this before in public, is you need to determine which are the best technologies to go ahead with at Wilver. It could be another EPR, the French design at Hinkley and Sizewell, because you'd then be using units 5 and 6, and you'd get the economies of scale and the economies of replication. Or it may be another design, and there are only 2 or 3 in the rest of the global market, but you would have to take a good look at that. There are sufficient lessons learned from the other technologies implementations around the world and from the EPR's implementation in the UK that would indicate to me, with government backing, that a gigawatt is absolutely deliverable, and it is deliverable at a more predictable cost than was ever possible when Hitachi pulled out.
But if I understand your answers to the previous questions, you have been focusing on the SMRs, so you've not taken significant steps to do that evaluation. So what are you basing your confidence?
My confidence is from my knowledge and the knowledge of our industry experts that we have either direct access to in GBN or outside GBN. What's stopping us is we don't have a policy for gigawatt. We don't know what the policy for gigawatt is. It's such a major investment that it does require a policy decision by the government. At the point they make it, all of what I've just said is valid, but we can't go forward without that.
Okay, so to follow up on that, are the proposals set out in the Civil Nuclear Roadmap and the consultation for a new nuclear national policy statement, are they adequate, do you think?
Sorry, could you answer that again?
Are they adequate to realise the government's stated ambitions?
They're adequate in terms of intent and direction. This government, as part of the declaration of what the nuclear policy is, I think in intent has said that it absolutely supports it, because it said it supports gigawatt, and the government has said it supports SMRs. So I don't think there's anything that challenges the detail of the roadmap. What we need is policy to now get into that in more detail and accelerate potential. How do you select and then get into the projects?
Just to follow up very quickly on that then. So you need policy in order to be able to take those next steps. But are there, beyond the decision to do gigawatt, is there other policy that is needed beyond that simple decision of we should go ahead with this? Is there something else that is needed in order to make this realisable?
Not in policy space, because Sizewell's being built within the same policy environment. This is just a declaration that we're doing more gigawatt. Are there more enabling activities that we need to do? Absolutely. There's a huge amount we need to do in the enabling space, which allows those projects to be delivered at pace and at a similar pace to the pace that other countries have done it.
Say briefly what those are.
Yeah, sure. And this again shares the space that we were talking about with Great British Energy and Mission Control. Is we need the long-term program to create the confidence so that so that people will invest, and then the enablers sit in the space of regulatory frameworks, permitting frameworks, DCO, the consent order process, our real nervousness about judicial review, because the nervousness within the system about being called into judicial review drives so much detail into the DCO applications and the environmental permits, etc., that that level of detail, and it's the statistic I gave you earlier on, is just really slowing down the process that we, for us to be able to get to a point where we can get to final investment decision and then into the build process. And then, of course, there's the skills and the supply chain. There's a lot of work to do in the skills and supply chain, and again, that comes from long-term certainty through the programme.
That very neatly brings us on to our next topic, which Torkel Crichton will be asking you about first.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Simon, for coming in. It's kind of reassuring, I suppose, given your job, that what keeps you awake at night is skills, and a skills shortage. And I don't believe for a second that you're retired. You just simply finished an apprenticeship, didn't you? And moved into this job. But part of the problem is, of course, that quite a lot of people in the industry are in the over 50s category, like 40%, yep. And you have a gap of 40,000 that you have to fill by 2030. You say it keeps you awake at night, but have you thought about solutions for that?
So there is some great work that was done by Sir Simon Bowen when he pulled together the Nuclear Skills Task Force, and we sensibly, as a group of industry executives and leaders, looked at defence and civil, because defence and civil are one conversation. And if you look at the extra demand that AUKUS puts on to the civil and defence nuclear family, the sector family, it's not 40,000, it's more like 140,000. It's enormous. So there is no simple solution to it. However, what are we doing? We have the Nuclear Skills Executive Committee or Council, which is a group of all of the chief executives of all of the nuclear companies, including government and the industry, BAE Systems, Babcock, EDF, etc. And we as a group of people have signed a charter about the way we're going to behave, because if we start robbing each other's people, that's not going to help. And we've made a commitment which says we will double the number of graduates, we will double the number of apprentices, and we will quadruple the number of PhDs that we bring into the industry. The funding's in place this year from the MOD and from DESNES to support that. We've got to fight for the funding for next year to make sure that continues going. And then, of course, it's supported by what I think is probably one of the best advertising campaigns I've seen since I've been in the industry, which is Destination Nuclear, which was developed by the Youth Generation Network, so the youngsters within the industry, people not of my age, and far more creative, luckily, on both counts. And they've pulled together both a campaign that tries to reach out to people who might be interested in nuclear, and also a website that pulls together every nuclear company in the UK as a centre where people can come and see all of the logos and click into every job that's available in the UK nuclear industry. And we advertise together, and there's a long-term advertising campaign that's been put out there on televisions. You may have seen it on the tube, but it's that sort of, how do you attract people in? And it is multifaceted. The only way to do this, and we're also looking at what are called mid-career switchers, people who are interested in either coming back into STEM-based subjects or coming back into nuclear. There is also a major piece of work we've got to do to improve the public's perception of nuclear, because it is, as a nuclear engineer I can say this, we are absolutely rubbish at explaining it in a short, interesting way.
Not unique to the nuclear industry.
Fabulous. I could say this. There's probably a pile of nuclear engineers who want to scream at me now, but we're not very good at describing what how fantastic nuclear is from a kind of career development and career opportunities, and getting over public perceptions about what nuclear is and isn't. So we've got a lot of work to do in all of those areas. And it still keeps me awake at night because it's a massive challenge because of the numbers that are required.
Thanks for that. You said your other big challenge is the supply chain and the domestic supply chain. And how resilient is that supply chain, or what are the weaknesses, and what can you do to address that?
Well, thanks to the work that the teams have done at Hinckley and Sizewell, it's far more robust than it was 5-10 years ago. So the supply chains are geared up to support nuclear programs. And the work that the individual vendors in our SMR selection process are on with, all of them have done a huge amount of work in the supply chain as well to work out what suppliers they want, and they're well on with their engagement. So the amount of the engagement has happened and is in progress. The key thing that's required now is the clarity of this is where we're going, this is how much we're going to build, which will be the final stage of people pressing the button for the recruitment that's required. But I think the initial work in terms of identifying what supply chains are required has been very well done by the vendors, Hinkley Point and Sizewell. What we now need is clarity on the next stage, which would allow people to recruit. They are recruiting already, but to recruit to the scale that is required within the industry. Okay,
I get you on this is where you're going. Where you are traditionally is in Cumbria and in Somerset and in Suffolk. And are you looking after the kind of the footprint and the jobs heritage in these areas while you're looking at new areas? And I might add to that from a Scottish perspective, Hunterston and Dumfries and Galloway and East Lothian as well. And may I add, is it a matter of regret for you that there is no nuclear in Scotland, that we're having something like 1,200 workers travel every week to Sizewell from Scotland and home?
So this is a personal view, not a view of anything other than me. Yeah, of course. There's a fabulous nuclear heritage in Scotland. I spent 3 years working in Dounreay, and the amount of capability that exists in Scotland is substantial, and we will do everything we can to capitalise on that capability. The other big opportunity that exists with SMRs, and indeed with Gigawatt, as you move towards a much more modular approach to construction, is the modular factories don't need to be next to the site. They can be where the workforce is, and one of the big attractions is you can take the work to the people as opposed to the people having to travel. And one of the biggest challenges you have on big infrastructure projects, particularly nuclear projects, is the number of people that need to travel to help you with the on-site construction.
If I can just ask one last quick one then, do you have any level of engagement with the Scottish Government about that modular programme and the fact that there are so many skilled people there in Scotland who could do it?
Don't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask you about the way the selection programme links to support for the supply chain? There's been some comment about some of the bidders using US or Czech Republic supply chains at the expense of UK ones, and the suggestion is that that's because of the way that other countries are much more inclined to use social value in their contracts than we are in this country. So there may be the potential for non-UK suppliers winning contracts. This goes to this point about suppliers having the confidence to continue to build on the investment. You made the point about the suppliers being more robust now, but there's a long way to go to cover that shortfall of 140,000 workers. So what's your response to those concerns about the way the contracts might be let?
We're in the learning phase with the vendors in the SMR process at the moment, so it'd be wrong of me to comment on what because I'm too distant from what their proposals are in terms of where they will seek to get their main components and their main work from. What I can say is that we will be looking very hard at you know, we've got to be careful because we can't legislate how much UK content there should be. But what we are looking very hard at is
no,
where
you can do something on social value, can't you? I mean,
yes, you do, and social value is a very important part, as it is in other government contracts, of our selection criteria. So it is absolutely in there. But where the individual vendors choose to draw their capabilities from, we will be looking at very carefully as part of the selection process. I can't go any further. Apologies, Chair.
Okay. Are you coming on something? Right. Which brings on to costs, investments and public support. And Polly Billington, you are next.
I didn't have myself down for this. I thought it was Vera was doing this one.
Okay.
I didn't really look, since I've been asked, Vincent, I've been asked, I'm asking some questions that we have, the committee has very helpfully put together. What steps are you taking to develop the domestic nuclear supply chain and ensure nuclear projects sourced from British companies?
And that's aligned to the conversation that we've had earlier on. I mean, we are, as Great British Nuclear, of course, we are drawing on British suppliers.
Sorry,
I think you're on.
It's a question 11. Yeah. Several nuclear projects in the UK have seen cost spiral, investors withdraw, and timescales lengthen. But I also want, and you have also already really responded to that. I think the main question that arises always around nuclear is really the public support piece. Because people are just worried about long-term costs, but also about nuclear itself as sort of a technology that frightens people. After all, I think I've shared with the committee that I'm originally from Germany. We were saying Atomkraft, nein danke. We were worried about the long-term costs, and particularly about the risks of storing and the legacy costs that you have with nuclear waste. So you have a sort of still a piece to really work on of how to also persuade the public that this is a long-term safe source of energy, not just in the next 10 years, but beyond that. And what are we doing with the legacy costs of nuclear energy?
Not a view shared by all communities.
No. But,
you get that. Completely get that.
I mean, since we're a committee who want to express different views, I'm sure I'm not the only one, and it will be interesting to hear that. I would also like to hear about your assertion about the baseload piece, but let's just first go about sort of allaying some fears that I might quite irrationally have, and people like me, around the safety around nuclear energy.
So with regard to the management of the legacy wastes, I believe that you're taking evidence from the NDA, and you should be talking to them about how they are, very effectively, I think, dealing with their with the current wastes that exist. So let me kind of come back to the start of your question. In the work that was done in preparation for COP, there was a public survey done of what people thought of nuclear, and 65% of the public support new nuclear as a power generating source, and also the majority of those people support government investing in that and supporting that. So there is no question that in my mind that has changed. In the work that we've done, the younger generation don't have the prejudices that maybe people of my age or that many other people have, because they see the benefits that it has with regard to net zero and its contribution. Yes. So is there more work to do? Yes, of course there is. The facts are that nuclear is the only industry that captures all of its waste and deals with it as part of the design. The regulators insist that as part of the design of any new nuclear reactor, that we assess what wastes it's going to produce and how those wastes will be dealt with, and we ensure through operation that funds are put aside to be able to deal with that for the time that it takes to deal with the waste and their safe storage going forward. I would contend that with our regulator, and I've got a huge admiration, as multiple people have around the world, for the quality of our regulator, is our regulator insists on the safe operation of the plants and the management of the waste, and we have a reputation for that worldwide. Hence the reason that people want to license their technology here. And the way in which the regulator insists that we both design and manage waste, to me, is means that we are, in my opinion, the safest nuclear industry in the world. And there's plenty of statistics to say that that's the case. Can I get you to
illustrate the point of to Vera's question? So I went to Hinkley C. Hinkley B was still open at the time, so I went to Hinkley B and then Hinkley C. And can you quantify for us the difference in the size of the reaction, therefore the quantity of waste ultimately from new nuclear compared to old generation?
So as a proportion, I know it's smaller, but I would be digging right to the back of my limited engineering capability to pull that data. I will write to you and tell you what that is. Very helpful. Thank you. But I can tell you what that is. I think so in terms of the...
Is there actually, about waste, because I talked to a small startup who were wanting to develop new modular nuclear, and I asked the question also about waste, and I said there's actually waste that can actually be dug up again, type of thing, sorry that for my rather sort of amateur language around this, that there are waste products that could be reused, and can you explain that a little bit, because I thought that was also a very exciting opportunity, and possibly for new investors into the industry.
There are multiple opportunities for the reuse of nuclear fuel. It's well recognised that a number of the materials that are stored at Sellafield can be reprocessed and reutilised to produce energy. If you look at the fuel cycle companies that exist both in the UK and in Europe, they are regenerating fuels from fuel that has already been irradiated. So there is a whole world of trying to make the most of every ounce of radioactivity to produce power. So there are multiple technologies that are available. The key question for a number of the new technologies is, are they economic, and what does it take to make them economic? So is that something we're looking at the moment? No, it's not. Are there a number of SMEs that are? Well, yes, there are, but that's not in our current sphere of, I don't say interest, but it's of what we're looking at. And why? Because what we're trying to do is deliver power to the bars as quickly as we can to answer the question of energy security and net zero. And for us, that's too uncertain at the moment, but it may well become a priority sometime in the future. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes and no, because part of our set of questions is what case can you then make to private investors? If that is not the bit, which one would be the bit where you can make a case to private investors?
Are you talking about more broadly in nuclear, or are you talking about in new tech and
no, but more broadly about nuclear.
Fine. So so with private investment, the whole debate for private investment in nuclear is who bears the risk. There is plenty of private investment out there that is prepared to support nuclear, as we're seeing through the work that is being done on the Sizewell fundraise. The core question comes down to who bears the construction risk, and that's where government has to step in, and there's structures to do that. So if you can create an environment, particularly if you take SMRs for the first of a kind, we will have to support the companies to ensure that that risk is underwritten, because it's a scale of risk that they likely don't want to take, or the cost of them taking it is too high. At a point where you get to second of a kind and those risks are retired, then private sector investment will flood in, because it's predictable in terms of risk management and return.
And risk is not defined by the nuclear in itself, but risk just by the duration?
There is no greater risk in an SMR, in the designs we're looking at, than there is in any other nuclear plant worldwide. These are well-proven technologies. The only risk that we all have to collectively manage is the construction risk.
And it's the time spans, is that what
it's time scales, it's integration of modules, it's all of that construction work that is the things that we have done elsewhere in infrastructure in the UK, that needs to be brought to bear to minimise those risks. So that's the risks, they are not nuclear risks.
Thank you. Bradley Thomas.
Mine's been covered, Chair.
Right. Julie Minns.
Yeah, it's just on that. I wondered if there are other countries that get this a bit better right than we do. or whether construction risk across the globe is exactly the same. And I guess my question is, are there other countries that are more successful in getting the private investment in for the building of their nuclear sector, or is it global? And if it is global, what part does this question about public support play? Because, I'm looking here at my notes and it looks like comparatively we have lower levels of public support than Germany, France and the US. Does that translate into a greater appetite for private investment in those countries? So there's two questions there, I suppose.
So the honest answer is whether there is there a great... I'm not sure there's a greater appetite for private investment. Let me take a step back. So if you look at who are the better countries, the one that everybody points to is Baraka, which is in the Emirates. And Baraka was a nuclear new build which started from nothing, with no capability, with no regulator, and they built it from nothing, and they built the whole process. They built a regulator with a huge amount of support from the global industry, and by the time they were on, I think it was the second unit, then it was delivered to time and cost. Now, so is that used as a model? Absolutely. How did they do it? It was a joint venture between the country, the government, and the Koreans, and the Koreans were prepared to fix price on their investment, and they did, and it was a difficult first build, but they became very good at it. So that is a good model to follow. Can you replicate that model in the UK? Well, construction practices and our how we, our unionisation means that direct approach does not map across into the UK. There are huge numbers of lessons that you can adopt, though. And if you can find somebody who's prepared to take the fixed price risks in the way that they did with the Koreans, absolutely you can start to de-risk. Now, is anybody better at getting private sector investment in? The only areas where there's talk about private investment is with the likes of Amazon and Microsoft investing in TerraPower and X-Energy in the US, but that is also backed up by DOE funding, government funding. So do I think there's a model where private investment comes into nuclear? No, I don't at the moment. And I can't see any model that does it purely on private sector investment at the scale we need to. It always sits between the government and the private sector sharing risk, but co-investing. Does that answer your questions?
Yes, I suppose that then negates the secondary question about where does public support, net out in this equation about, making it attractive for private investment. I think what you're saying is, it's not even a factor.
It's not a factor, but if you take it, maybe a slightly different point. But if you look at the French system, they get public support because of what they give the local communities, and they are clamouring for nuclear plants. That's probably a slight exaggeration, but they are clamouring for nuclear plants because they can see what's in it.
Right.
In France.
We're going to move on to our final section, which is structure and evolution, and Claire Young, you're first, please.
So obviously we spoke to GB Energy previously, and how do you expect GB Nuclear to work alongside GB Energy? And can you clarify what their specific responsibilities are in relation to nuclear energy?
We are essentially set up currently to sit alongside each other but not to integrate. And this is early days because this is it's an early stage of GB Energy's formation. We are right in the middle of some pretty complex commercial work, and therefore integrating them now makes no sense because it'll be a distraction to both organisations. Juergen and I though have an absolute agreement that there are many areas where we should be working closely together and collaborating, and all the work the mission control is doing, all the enabling stuff I was talking about earlier on, that's natural territory for us to sit together. Now in time, should we be looking at how the various functions that we operate would be better combined? Absolutely, and we're very open-minded to that. What we have to bear in mind is currently the setup of GB Energy and GB Nuclear are quite different. We're an arm's length body. They're going to be an independent company with government shareholding. So we have to work out how all of that's going to work together. But in terms of how the two organisations work together, GB Energy have no current interest within the nuclear space. It is purely about the delivery of renewables and the decarbonisation of the grid by 2030. Do I think that's the long-term answer? No, I don't, because I think the two naturally sit alongside each other and the synergies are well worth exploring, just not yet.
In answer to my question, you're essentially saying they have no specific responsibilities in relation to nuclear.
Correct.
Okay. So how do you see, you talked earlier about the fact you're focused on SMR at the moment, you've not looked, because you're waiting for the policy on gigawatt, but how do you foresee your role evolving over time? And I'm from your earlier answers, I'm suspecting the answer is what you focus on next is gigawatt provision. But are there other things that you're likely to focus on once the SMR programme is complete?
Well, I think in parallel, gigawatt and AMRs, you both have to, and gigawatt will be determined by whether the government wants to, go for a large target and thinks that the investment is something they're prepared to support. AMRs, no question, will be looking at that very carefully because the call themselves the hyperscalers, the people like Amazon and Microsoft getting involved, and with all of the energy needs of data centers and AI, all of the energy needs there means that nuclear is one of the only answers for the levels of power density that they need. So it is the natural next step for Great British Nuclear, working with the department to work out what that looks like. So where do I think Great British Nuclear will go in time? In the SMR space, it depends on what the on which vendors are successful, because our model will have to will move as we determine what capabilities and skills they bring and what we think needs to be supplemented, what we need control over, what we don't. And it'll be very similar in terms of the process with AMRs. As we explore the market and determine what the market has to offer, that will determine what role we have. What will be consistent, though, is that we will oversee the nuclear programme and we will have oversight on behalf of the government of the entire nuclear programme, at the moment with the exception of Sizewell C.
So and this is my final question, I think, if we want to pose the question, how should we judge your success, then it sounds like it's very difficult for you to set benchmarks when you haven't got that clarity about where you're going to evolve to. But what would you say at this point in time?
So our how do I define success? It's delivering to the programme as we set it out. It's and demonstrating for the technology to be choose that they are value for money, long-term value for money for the taxpayer. Those are, if you look at the, of course, setup of the organisation, all of the enablers, there are many things that we'll have to tick off to say, yes, we've done that, and that enables new nuclear developments. But it'll be once we've placed the contract with the SMR vendors, what will be measured on is delivery to time and budget. That's where it's going to go, and of course the strategic investment in AMRs in time.
Thank you, Luke Murphy.
Thank you. I had a question I was going to ask specifically related to that, around whether it would make sense for GB Energy and GB Nuclear to be one body. I feel like you've answered that. Potentially, maybe in the future, but maybe you want to answer that at the start. I wanted to come back to value for money, and obviously nuclear was only one part of it, but we have famously kind of quite a lot of infrastructure projects that run quite significantly over cost in the UK. I was speaking to someone who's kind of quite senior in a non-nuclear infrastructure company the other day, who talked about the fact that there are engineers that get £1,200 a day on certain projects, and they were asked why they were able to do that, and they're able to do that because they didn't think that we have sufficient commercial expertise within government in order to deliver value for money for the taxpayer. So I guess it's a long way of asking, do you think we have sufficient commercial expertise within government to deliver value for money on nuclear projects? And why? I mean, maybe you feel like it's beyond your scope to say, but for wider infrastructure projects as well.
So the first part of your question is, will GB and GBN merge in time? We don't know yet. It depends how they, the objectives of both organisations are pretty stretchy. It's something that we'll come back to, but we are both very open to that as a possibility. Absolutely. The value for money one is if the government had the right commercial capability and technical capability to derive value for money from nuclear, they wouldn't have formed Great British Nuclear. You wouldn't need it. So the answer is no, it hasn't. And that's why we've been formed. There's a huge amount of work for us to do to define what value for money really is in nuclear projects. And particularly in the SMR space, you can't judge value for money on one project. If you want to do one project, you don't do SMRs. There's just no point. What you do need to do is a fleet of them, and it is the analysis of fleet that will determine whether they are or are not value for money. And the commercial expertise that we bring, and one of the big things we're doing is setting up the development companies. You'll have seen there was another Telegraph article about a 1.8 billion potential contract that we're putting into the market. That's all about setting up the development companies with the capability to manage the construction. How do you de-risk in the way that you do across all of infrastructure projects? Well, you don't dig a hole until you've completed the design. I mean, it's as basic as that. And there are multiple lessons learned. So it is, fighting off the need to move fast and saying, the phrase is, think slow, act fast. And it's absolutely true. All of the work, our aim is to get to a point that when we are ready to put a spade in the ground, that it is no higher risk than any other infrastructure program. And if we can get to that stage, one, it makes it more investable for the private sector, but two, we can have a much better view of value for money for the taxpayer.
I guess just very quickly, if that commercial expertise doesn't exist in government, I guess when we're thinking about other infrastructure projects, is there going to be a way to learn from and build on the expertise that's in your body to what other infrastructure projects? How are we going to ensure that what you learn in delivery of nuclear projects is actually then, there's some learnings for other infrastructure projects?
So there are very capable commercial people within the various parts of government, particularly in the Cabinet Office and areas of Treasury and in DESNZ as well. What I'm talking about is the specialist capability that we have in terms of infrastructure. Yes, there's the ability to learn. We're talking to HS2, we're talking to all of a large amount of the capability we're drawing on has worked on Sizewell, and before that was involved in Thames Tideway. So those lessons learned and all of the commercial capability, we're drawing from all of that to be able to form the capability that we have in GBN to be able to go into the market with confidence.
I'm sort of sitting there thinking about whether it's in government or just available in the UK, having that capability. And I mean, Juergen Maier earlier said the supply chain was the big prize. Do you see the nuclear supply chain for SMRs, as that's the sort of leading priority, do you see that as being mostly UK based?
Yes, I do, because I mean, if you look at Hinkley and Sizewell, yes, a lot comes, a lot of major component manufacture may happen elsewhere, but 60 to 70% of all of the work is done by the UK supply chain. And the construction of factories to be able to build SMRs, of course we want them in the UK. And do I believe they will be in the UK? Absolutely yes. They have to be. And it's our job to make sure that they are.
That's very, very encouraging. Thank you. Josh McAllister.
Yeah, just a final one from me, Simon, which is about the decision making as we move through the process towards FID for the SMR round by 2029, which I'm assuming is still the target date. Okay. How many people? So you've got your chief executive, your board, DESNZ, Cabinet Office, Treasury. How many people are involved in the decision stages along the way, and is that an efficient process for all of the things that we've been discussing in this session about pace, expertise, and just some real candour from you on that would be appreciated, realising there is some sensitivity in your answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Simon, you've been entirely candid all the way through.
I have been candid.
Yeah, of course. I'm
just wondering. I'm just wondering.
It's a tricky one for you to answer, but I'm conscious of how, we set these things up, and we still retain a lot of the decision making in government, and that, giving you some responsibility without the power. So.
So I'm just wondering which size spade I'm going to use. Because we are spending likely to spend a huge amount of taxpayers' money, we have to apply rigour to it. Of course we do. We absolutely do. And we have set up a board that has the capability to make recommendations on behalf of GBN. So I am comfortable that the process within GBN is moving towards being a very efficient process, because it's not multi-layered. It is a executive that reports into the board with a subcommittee that provides advice to us. As I pointed to earlier on, to make this happen quicker, you can't do decisions in series, and it does require this forcing function akin to the Olympics, which has a imperative of energy security, and that means that you have to do things differently. So, and I've said this on multiple occasions: is everybody's doing their job, which is fine. This is not about people doing a bad job. It's that we can't do it in series, and we have got to collectively, as a system, value time. Because in major projects and infrastructure, minutes and days matter.
They all add up. And I think the question comes from a place of sharing the importance around that imperative. But if we've not made a permanent appointment of chair and chief executive in 18 months, the parallel with Olympic delivery, if we put the two side by sides on decisions and time available, I think we'd look a bit off track on nuclear.
Well, and I wouldn't appoint. So. Of course I would say this, but I don't think that myself or my chief executive, if you looked at either of us, you would never know that either of us are interim, because we're so committed to it.
Sorry to follow up on Josh, there's no reflection on you, it's a reflection on the system and the process, which is clearly failing in managing to hit your forcing function kind of imperative.
So I think it is, and I think it is more about that, and of course we're trying to move at pace, and it has taken us a long time to get to a point where we've been able to recruit, but we're now on with it. But what we now need is we need to become more arm's length with greater delegations, and of course we've got to earn that trust. But until we do that, then moving at pace is pretty challenging.
That's very helpful.
Simon Bowen, thank you very much for giving evidence to us.
Great, thanks, Simon.
Order.